So let's say that you have your flash of realization that you left your keys behind, and
Yeah.
it didn't take any time for it to come to you, right?
Mm.
It does still. I mean, this seems to me right that it still has to be that the thought takes place at a time, right? Even if it's an infinitesimally small instant of time, because the opposite seems like it doesn't make much sense that I have the realization. It takes me no time to come up with the realization, but that also I don't have it at any particular time. That seems to me that that's the same as saying that I don't have the realization, right? If I
Yeah,
have a
but that's,
thought, it has to be located at a time. So
yeah, that's because I live in a temporal world, so it's true for me. But let's say God exists without the universe, there is no time, but God knows every true proposition. It's just there.
I mean, yeah, it just to some extent. I mean, I feel like there's some things where, like, if you take away the idea of a thought happening at a time, it's a bit like taking away the idea of an object having a location. It kind of seems like it's taken away something like its identity conditions. I mean, I'm not even sure how we would
Well,
identify the thought if it didn't happen at a time. So, I mean, you
no,
can
that's
say the
why.
words, but I'm just not sure I understand what they mean if you say a thought that doesn't happen at any particular time.
But that's why I asked the question. Well, does God have thoughts? If he just no, I mean, certainly without the universe. If God exists without the universe and he doesn't exist in some meta time, he exists timelessly, but he has knowledge, then he can't have thoughts because thoughts and thinking are processes, and processes require time.
Yeah, right. So
Even
it does seem
even
to lead to the
infinitesimal
conclusion.
changes of, yeah, even the smallest change would be, time would be there. So if God exists timelessly and has knowledge, then he has timeless knowledge. And thinking and thoughts, to me, go against that kind of way of thinking.
So doesn't that lead you to think? I mean, but do you still think that there could? I mean, so okay, let's say thinking sounds like a temporal
Yeah,
thing, right? It doesn't really
process.
make much sense if it's not in time. Don't you think the idea of a kind of extended body needs some kind of space for it to be at a location or something? Like the idea of an extended body, but not at a location, doesn't seem like it makes sense in the same way that a thought not at a time doesn't really seem like it makes any sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, with God, without the
Right.
universe, there's no location and there's no process.
But
There's
I
no.
mean, then it just seems like what? How is it still intelligible to talk about an agent that's not located in space or time? Then I mean,
So
doesn't
how's
stop
it
being
how's it
intelligible.
unintelligible? Why must every agent be located in space and time?
Well, I mean, I just said like you agreed with the thought bit, right? It does seem like take a, the time away from a thought, and then it doesn't seem like you've really got anything left. I mean, take the space away from an extended body, it seems like you don't really have anything left as well. So I mean, but what else is there to an agent? I mean,
The being.
well,
I
what's
mean, I
that?
mean, I mean, if you define an agent, a being, as something that's located in time and space, then obviously, if you remove time and space, you don't have a being.
Yeah, but I don't feel like I'm just arbitrarily positing that that's a definition. It just feels like I don't really know what else there. Like, I mean, I'm happy for you to explain it to me, but like, what else is there? Um,
There's just being. There's just existence. There's just a being existence with knowledge.
yeah,
That doesn't comport with our understanding in a temporal world and with location there. It doesn't follow from that it can't be the case. It just feels
it doesn't follow that it
counterintuitive.
can't be the case. That's true, but
Yeah,
it
it's
doesn't. Also,
counterintuitive.
doesn't mean just because you say the words that anything actually corresponds to them. Because I mean, like,
Exactly. Hence why you have to have arguments for that. And that's what the column comes into it and things like that, which drives you to that conclusion,
but so
or
like, yeah,
attempt to
that's
drive you to
fine.
that conclusion.
Possibly, but like, why? I mean, if the thing is unintelligible, like, well, it seems like I can't understand what it means. Then I wouldn't know how to form a belief about that type of thing in the first place. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, if I just describe like a schmumble, I just to say that there's this thing called a schmumble, doesn't have any properties that are intelligible to you. I can't describe what it's like in any way.
But
Um,
but we can do that with God, and that's where analogical language comes in. That's where when you referred to Thomas Aquinas, when he makes reference to analogical language, which don't fully capture what God is, and because God is inscrutable in that sense, but there's some commonality between us and God in those kind of things.
Yeah, see, I feel like the analogical language idea that is very unsatisfactory as well, because like with a normal analogy, it's normally, well, I mean, with a normal analogy, you can specify both the way in which the thing is different and the way in which the thing is the same. Like I use an analogy not often just to save time or for poetic effect or something. But you know, if pressed, I'd probably be able to describe to you the similarity between the two things, right? Like if I say he was like a volcano of anger or something. Right?
But that's because everything you're describing is within this world.
Yeah, exactly. But that's how analogies work, right? And then
if you were trying to use analogical language to explain an extraterrestrial being, you might find that's not possible to do it so comfortably.
You're right, exactly. And that's the problem with saying that you can use analogical language to describe something that's like ultimately kind of ineffable and something you can't understand. Because I can say, oh, God is like, it has thoughts, but that, you know, they're a bit like thoughts, but they're also not like thoughts. But then like, if I say, well, I know what thoughts are like, well, in what way is his thoughts different from mine? You can't explain that.
Yeah, right? They're the contents of his mind.
Well, in what way is his mind like mine? Because my mind exists in time and his doesn't. My mind has a brain and stuff and his doesn't. So like I kind of lose any familiar content at all. And then the analogy doesn't help it in any sense, right?
Yeah, but that would hold true for any being that existed outside of time. You're just saying basically that because you live in a temporal world and you're restricted to a temporal world, that you can't fathom anything existing in a different way than from what you exist in, which is kind of.
What I'm saying specifically, if you're using
something like that,
if you're
using,
not
special.
Thanks. What I'm saying is that if I'm using analogical language, right? I'm just saying, look, let me just say this. If I'm using analogical language, but I can't independently describe the aspect of similarity between the two things that I'm comparing, like if it's in principle impossible for me to do that, then the analogy sort of breaks down. It doesn't really, it looks like a method of communication, like a novel compromise between the, whatever it is, equivocal and, what's the other, there's two.
Univocal, equivocal, and analogical.
Right. Analogical is supposed to be some kind of middle ground between them. But because it doesn't, like, because it kind of like, there's this mystery, like I just don't know in what sense God's mind is like mine, right? And it's not, and I think the minute for me, I feel like I'm not really being told anything, right? You just, that's the problem with the analogical answer. I just, like, if what you're doing, the aim of it is to explain it to me, and I can't understand it after you've used this analogical mechanism, then it's failed to explain it to me, right?
No, so, but the intention is not to explain it fully, because the whole idea is that God cannot be explained or understood fully. It can only be explained and understood imperfectly by us because of what we are. So you're not looking. You're not.
But he's saying it's not explained at all. That's the problem.
Yeah.
I don't think that would be the. I mean, if someone says to me like I had this discussion with Trey Jadlow and Bert Poole, where I interjected in a conversation between them, and basically Bert Poole was asked what are God's thoughts and what would be analogical to that, and I said, well, I thought to myself, well, okay, so let's say we say that the analogous point, the thing that's similar to God's thoughts and our thoughts is that God's thoughts is the content of his mind, and I know what I have content in my mind. So in some way, those are speaking of something similar. So I can grasp that. I don't have any conceptual problems grasping that idea of God's thoughts as the content of his mind, the same as I have content of his mind. It's not the same. It's not exactly equivocal, or else you wouldn't be using analogical. But it gives me some sort of idea of what I'm talking about when I talk about God's thoughts.
But no, look, so the idea is more just so focus on like one word, right? If we're saying that God has a mind, right, and then I say, well, what do you mean by mind? And you say, well, so maybe I say, well, a mind like mine, right? I know a mind is a human mind. Is that what you mean when you say that God's got a mind? And you'd say, well, no, because that would be to use univocal language, right? And it doesn't help if you use completely equivocal language and just say, well, he has mind in a completely different way from you, right? That doesn't tell me anything, right? But then if you say, well, there's some sense in which your mind is like, it's an analogy, right? So there's something about your mind is the same as his, but in some sense it's different. Well, what is it that's the same between those two, first of all?
Reasoning, the abilities to reason, logical, rational, spiritual. You could use all those terms to describe.
Let's just pause for a second. And so, like, when you're reasoning, right? Can you like when we just had this same like thought process a minute ago, right? Can you understand the idea of reasoning happening that doesn't happen at any particular time?
No. So you retract that and you say God's mind is perfectly rational.
Look, if God's mind is supposed to be like mine, because the thing that's similar about it is that we can both reason. But then when I ask you about that, you say that he doesn't actually reason in the same way that I reason. That's not in the common.
No, I retract reason because it's a process like thinking.
Right, but for me, it's kind of intrinsic to reasoning that it happens at a time. So if you're saying
because you're a temporal being.
Right, but how am I supposed to understand it then? What you're trying to do here is explain it to me.
Because you know what,
and saying, but it's like that, but not like that, and that doesn't help.
You know what it's like to be a rational being, right?
I'd like to think so.
Right. So in some way, that's what God's being is like.
Well, but what way?
Yeah, but and whatever way you identify yourself as being you say you know what it's like to be a rational creature. Well, in some way that's similar to how the creator of creature is as a rational being. So he's not illogical.
Okay.
He's not illogical. He's not contradictory. He's not different from himself. So the law of identity holds to God. So those things, they give you an idea. They give you an inkling, an insight, a little chink of light into what it means to say God is a rational being.
Right, but so for me, it doesn't make any sense to conduct reasoning unless that's a temporal process.
But I've already retracted reasoning.
Right, but
I said that's a temporal process. Reasoning is a rational process.
I don't understand what it is to be a rational being, but not conduct any kind of reasoning process. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, a rational being is I suppose you could say the opposite of an irrational being. So God is rational in regards to he exists in accord with the fundamental laws of thoughts, for example, which doesn't involve any reasoning process. God is the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, things like that, the excluded middle. Those are the fundamental laws of rationality, and God's being is like that. He is himself.
But look, isn't it the case that everything exists in accordance with the principle of non-contradiction or something? I mean, unless you want to say there are things that don't, right? If it really is, then that doesn't tell me anything, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a difference between. I think there's a difference between the position of being in a state where you can say that doesn't tell me anything, and being in a state of that not telling you anything. So if I find it informative to me to think about God as a rational being, so God is rational, so he's not some crazy nutter who's going to act irrational. He's not going to do irrational things and things like that. He's not something completely different from myself in regards to, if he were in time, then he would reason the same as I reason using logic type thing.
Well, but what's it?
So all of these are giving me an idea of the type of being that God is.
Well, no, because if you're saying that the way I know about, so there's this timeless thing, right? And I know what it's like because I just say, if it was in time, it would be like this. Well, I mean, I'm not even sure how you make that determination, but it doesn't help to know what the thing's like when it's not in time to be told what it's like if it were in time, right? You may as well just say, Like, if I wasn't in time, then I'd be like God. That doesn't help it in any way either, right?
I think, you know what, possibly the idea of God being a rational being goes against the previous thought about God not having thoughts, because on the one hand, the argument is, well, what does it mean for something to exist timelessly and changelessly and then go through a process? Well, it loses meaning. There's no, if God is thinking or reasoning, then time's there, because time is a measurement of change, and reasoning and thinking involve change. So if you're going to have God as a rational creature, and by that you mean a reasoning creature, then you need to have God existing in time. But
Right.
but that's postulated by no, that's not inconsistent with the existence of God, where God exists in some sort of meta time, and he creates our time with the universe. So I mean, I don't, in that situation, where God exists in some sort of meta time, then
See, I don't understand what meta time is.
the meta time would be something like the I think Craig describes it, or Alan Paget describes it, as the content of God's mental, the stream of mental consciousness, something like that. I need to look at the article, but something like that, where it's not something that exists outside of God. It's basically the content of God's mental thinking that constitutes time, the meta time, and from that meta time, God creates the universe with chronological time that we know of.
So is meta time an A theory of time?
Meta time and A theory, yeah, of course. I mean, you don't get the creation of the universe on a B theory of time.
Okay, so and on this view, also normal time is an A theory as well, right?
Yeah.
So there's two independent A theories.
I don't know where you get the A theory of time. Basically, is stating that there is a now, there's a special moment now.
Mm-hmm.
The future doesn't exist and the past is gone.
Mm-hmm.
But with God, I don't think it's right. I don't think, if you're talking about an eternal being, then I don't think an eternal being without beginning or without ending, who doesn't exist in a temporal world, I don't think it makes sense to talk about that being existing in an A theory or a B theory of time.
But weren't you just postulating God existing in a meta time that was an A theory?
Yeah, meta time consisting of his own mental content, the content of his own consciousness, something like that. I don't know the exact phraseology. There's an article by Craig called "God in Real Time," where he takes a position put forward by Alan Paget, trying to postulate God existing in real time as opposed to chronological time, to try and resolve some of the objections to the Callum cosmological argument and such like, about things like that. But what's interesting to me is that it would seem to me like, let's take, for example, let's say I couldn't define to you at this point what this meta time is, right?
Yeah.
Let's say whatever that meta time is, it allows for reasoning, for God to be reasoning. Then you could understand God as a rational being, right?
Well, I'm not sure that I can understand the idea of there being two separate nows.
I think
but I just
the
said,
idea would be, you understand the idea of like there being two orthogonal timelines.
I can understand there being two orthogonal dimensions. I can understand two B theories.
Well, like, I think the idea would be something like this, right? Like, let's say, let's imagine that I can see the whole timeline at once, right?
Mm-hmm.
So imagine the timeline is just a line, just a regular line segment, right? And I can sort of see, the creation happens at point A, and human beings emerge, at point B, and, the Declaration of Independence is signed at point C, right? And I can see the whole thing as a single block,
Yeah.
right? Single line, right? So I think the idea is that God is in a temporal dimension himself, right? He experiences the passage of time, but he's actually able to see in this, let's say, call it an object time, right? He's in meta time, let's say. So let's say the timeline is an object time. He's able to see the whole timeline at once.
Yeah.
But
Sure.
for somebody in the timeline, right, they're experiencing it as temporal passage, something like
Yeah.
that.
Okay. But see, that is there may be an A theory. Meta time might be an A theory, but you couldn't also hold that there's that the object time or whatever on the timeline is an A theory. You have to hold that it's just a line.
Yes.
Right?
I don't
There
understand
can't
what
be
it would
two
be.
A theories.
I wouldn't understand. Yeah, I don't understand what.
Why can't you have two A theories?
Well, it seems to me that if you did, then they collapse into each other, right? So like, try and think about what it would be like, right? Like, so God's outside watching the timeline, and what he does is he sees this spotlight moving up the timeline, and wherever the spotlight's pointing on the timeline is wherever the now currently is, or something. Well, those like, and let's say he watches the clock on the wall as the spotlight moves up the timeline. Well, obviously those two things are going to be in step with each other, right? As the second hand clicks around on the clock on the wall, there also the moving now creeps up the timeline. So there isn't really two independent A series. There's just one big A series, right? That has two types of movement within it, basically. I can't. It seems conceptually incoherent to me, the idea that there could be two different moving nows that move independently of each other. I'm not saying it's metaphysically impossible. I'm just saying I can't understand that. I don't. If someone can explain a model to me that makes sense, that isn't actually just a B theory and an A theory, then or two B theories, then I'd
I mean, if God exists in a B theory world and we exist in an A theory world, then so God in a B theory world, God sees things as a block. So God knows the beginning from the end. So that's consistent with a B theory. That's
well, if God exists
God is
in
omniscient,
theory, right, but not in the A theory, then there are things that he doesn't know, like what time it is.